Welcome back, everyone, to the Property Journey Podcast, episode 29. And today, Roy, I have commercial property on the agenda. So I'm going to pick your brain about commercial side of things. And rather than maybe like a landlord perspective, it's more of an investment perspective. So we'll go to run through it, understanding the basics, sort of investment side of things, all those different wee kind of categories, just to kind of give people a wee bit more of an understanding about the option of commercial, you know. So what kind of then is considered commercial in the UK, and how is it kind of different from residential property?
I suppose a very simple way of explaining it is commercial is anything that's not a house or somebody's not living in. So the obvious ones would be the likes of shops, units, any sort of a shop unit, whether it is on a high street, whether it's an office, or something even bigger like in an industrial estate, those sorts of things. So that's it, very simply, what you would count as commercial.
And that's probably the main types, is where I was going to lead on to then, was anything, as you say, from a shop front that sells clothes to a takeaway, for example, that sells food, to an office space, or industrial, could be a warehouse, could be, those are all obviously common types then of commercial property.
Yeah. I suppose one big difference between what's commercial and what's residential is maybe how it's valued as well. You know, commercially, you're looking at the value of it. A lot of the times you're looking at what's the rental income, what's it worth, because what's it's worth, what it's bringing you in to a percentage then of the value of it. Whereas a residential is generally most of the time looked at, you know, maybe what's the cost of building, what's the value, what's somebody willing to pay for it. After that, the rental income would most times have very little to do with the value of residential.
Because there's obviously a big difference between residential and commercial. And I suppose, why would people maybe choose to go down the route of commercial? Is there like reasons why sort of people would tend to go down it?
There can be a number of reasons. So from the point of hassle, if you go down the commercial route, if you rent out to a commercial tenant, what happens then is, in most scenarios, the tenant is responsible for everything. Even if there's a leak in the roof, you know, paying the insurance, absolutely everything, the tenant is responsible. Compare that to a residential house, whereby the landlord most commonly is responsible for a lot of it. So when you weigh the two of them up, well, from a hassle point of view, commercial is easy in one regard. Another reason can be a balanced portfolio. Some people have a view, well, I've got a few houses or I've got a lot of houses, maybe it's time to balance out the portfolio, look into commercial as well. Third reason could be the money side of things. The two extremes, you can pick up very, very cheap commercial property, like maybe, for instance, a shop on a town. You could pick it up for maybe as low as £50,000. I've seen one there at the minute. It's going through. It was an old greengrocer shop, and I think it's going to sell for about £48,000. So it's a very, very low price, but you know, the rental income off that is going to be very, very low. So maybe somebody wants to get into commercial because they've got a smaller budget, or the other flip side of a budget point of view, maybe an investor has a lot of money or is happy to borrow a lot of money. So therefore, instead of buying a house at 100,000, they're willing to borrow or buy property at, you know, $500,000, $1 million plus. So that's the difference.
And I'm just sitting here thinking, and I don't even know if it comes in under this or not, but rates, who would cover the likes of rates then? Does that fall under the business that is renting the unit rather than the landlord?
So from a residential point of view, it's always the landlord's responsibility, unless the house has a rateable value over £250,000. But for a typical house in a development or on the street being rented out, the landlord's responsible. For commercial, as soon as a tenant goes in, the tenant is fully responsible. They're fully responsible for all costs, as I said, you know, even the rates, the water, the electricity, everything, until the property then becomes vacant. So whenever it becomes vacant, then there are different reliefs that you can claim for. That you can get like a rates holiday for so many months, and then it falls back onto the landlord. But from a day-to-day point of view, once it's rented out and running smoothly, it's the tenant's responsibility.
Because that's obviously, when it comes to business rates and especially town centres, things like that there, the rates are obviously a lot more than, certain other areas, and especially probably in relation to property rates in terms of residential rates, the cost is quite substantially different.
It's a lot higher because they're factoring in, I don't know what they're factoring in. Speak to many businesses, speak to myself, what I pay in rates every year, and you think to yourself, my goodness, what am I getting here in return? People always immediately think, oh, it's costing a lot just to get my bin emptied. That's a very, very small portion. What a lot of people don't realise is it goes to running the local facilities by the council, and also the vast majority of it goes back up to the main government, up to Stormont, which is then distributed out towards all your healthcare and all the different departments.
Because as you say there about getting your bins emptied, and yet there's so many businesses out there have to actually pay to get their bins emptied commercially anyway. Yeah. So, well, we'll not get into a full debate about rates today.
No.
Because we could be here half the day. Right, let me see about, in terms of, as you say there, about the pricing point on commercial property, it can be as low as 48,000, it could be lower, it could be obviously dependent on how willing you are to go. You could buy an office block.
Yep, I can think of an example recently, which was a block of 10 apartments, and then down below there was an office in it, and that there you're looking at probably, it was 1.5 million, but that, whenever all the rental income brought together, was giving you an overall gross return of about 9%. So from an investor point of view, somebody who has a substantial amount of money, well, it's much easier to buy the likes of that as opposed to going and buying, 10, 15 individual houses. At least this one block, maintenance point of view is going to be a lot easier. Purchasing everything can be a lot more straightforward.
Because as you say there, for example, if you buy 10 different residential properties that are spread over the, half the county, for example, that's all well and good, but you have to travel between them if there's maintenance issues, if there's obviously keeping an eye on different areas, all that side of things. Whereas as you say there, if you're buying a block of 10 apartments, they're all in the one block, so you're only going to one place, and a commercial unit below it it's all packaged up quite nicely for you.
And even easier still, for instance, I've come across somebody buying an industrial unit. That unit, or a whole unit, could be the size of it all depends, could be £1 million, and it's bringing in 100,000 for instance a year, or 90,000 a year. That's only one tenant that you're dealing with to get the 90 or 100,000, as opposed to 10 individual houses.
Because the question I was going to ask was, how much money do you realistically need to get to be started in commercial? But it really is dependent on what you're buying.
Yes, another reason, I didn't say earlier on, why people would buy commercial could be for themselves. So, for instance, if you were a business owner and you needed a high street presence, whether it's a shop, whether it's an office, it's very common that the business would buy the shop themselves, because the view they take is, well, I'm going to pay in rent anyway. I have a slightly different view on that, depending on if it is a shop or what have you, because the capital growth, the value of the property doesn't always rise as much. So my view is that's why would I invest so much money in a shop that's not going to rise? And then also my view is to grow the business and continually grow the business. So if I buy a building, I'm curtailed to that building. If I then decide, in 6 months' time, or whether it's 3 years' time, without outgrowing this building, it's a very difficult process, a slow process to sell, find somewhere else and what have you. So that's a reason. But to get into commercial premises, normally you really need a sizable amount of money. The more money you can put into it, probably the better return. There's a lot of commercial property out there at the minute if you go down the high street, but it maybe needs a lot of work done to it. And then again, what are you going to do with it? It is really, really, really sad to say, but the high street is slowly dying. What you see at the minute is, unless it's beauty or cosmetics or anything linked to that, there's not much on the high street. A lot of the multinationals are now all drawn towards back into the shopping centres, and so on the town itself, there's not the same number of offices. A lot of offices are moving to shared offices, and there's no greengrocers, there's nothing of that. So unless it's the likes of a barber shop, hairdressers, makeup, beauty, nails, whatever, all linked to all of that there, which you normally find are possibly the smaller units, because the smaller units are more cost effective.
That's what I was about to say. That leads into the argument of the rise in sort of smaller units popping up, where someone's maybe buying a piece of land and popping 6 or 10 or maybe 12 small units.
There's a demand for maybe buying a shop as it is and splitting it up. So it could be a real big shop, and that's being split up into a number of small units.
Because it is, like as you say there, the high street, and you can clearly see it, but it's probably every other week you click onto the news and some sort of a multinational business or whatever is pulling out of the high street and they're closing X amount of units. The banks there was recently one of the big ones, Santander's obviously closing quite a few units, and obviously here in Armagh it's one of the ones that's going to be affected. There's another shop unit that's empty, and the difficulty then is sometimes when it comes to, maybe the older style banks, is what do you do with that building? Yeah. Because it's
most of the time it's probably custom built or adopted, and it can be very difficult to, change the building because of the security reinforcements that were put into it. But, that example, I didn't say it there, with commercial, in theory, and the way it used to be was once you got it rented out, you had somebody for years on years. It was very common. The likes of those banks would have signed up to easily 15, 20 year leases. So as you as a landlord, that was brilliant, because you bought a building and you knew 20 years you had somebody in there every single year. Nice and simple. Whereas now...
And the chances are it probably paid for itself within maybe that 20 years.
Absolutely. More than that, easily. And then the whole lot maintained, everything taken care of. So it was simple. Whereas that's what makes it more difficult now, because like all those buildings, the banks are pulling out. The building is adopted fully for a bank. There's not the same demand for another business to come in and take a full building floor to 2-3 stories and occupy it fully.
Especially, I suppose, when you look at probably the pricing on it now as well. For a building maybe that size, what are you looking? Probably £2,500, maybe £3,000 a month.
What if you're renting it?
If you were to, for a tenant to go in there, from a tenant's perspective, you're probably looking.
It's difficult to say, and even if it wasn't as much as that, you have to then add on the rates. So whenever you add the rates on and all the maintenance and all the costs linked to it, it is quite expensive to operate a building like that. So that's why there's very few businesses out there who have the numbers of employees. Anybody, and typically most businesses that have a large number of employees need to be in a custom built building, the likes of a factory or a call center, something like that. But for anything else, like even in our game, solicitors, a building, any of those buildings are far too big.
Yeah. And then it's what you do with them, and having to maybe try and think of something and working around it or whatever. In terms then of returns, and I suppose we've talked there kind of what previous returns would have been, but like in terms of what you would get in a return wise on commercial compared to residential, residential buy to let, for example, is there a massive difference? Is there, as you say, you're not paying out maybe the same in a commercial property as you would be if you're residential, but is there a difference maybe then in the rent?
There's probably, I'm just trying to think, on a gross return, there may not be much in it. as in the commercial might pivot that bit better. It's really down to the convenience of it. You're building a bigger portfolio if you have larger money and you're dealing with fewer tenants, and then you have an ability to increase the value easier. So for instance, if you go in and buy a complex that maybe has 10 units, but one of the units or two of the units are sitting empty, or a tenant's not paying, or you maybe put an extension onto it and create another unit or what have you, that's what's increasing the value. Immediately I can think of a client a few years ago bought an industrial estate which had the large multinationals in it, but there was a massive car park at the side of it. Got planning permission for a big unit and another. So simply got the planning permission and then advertised saying here's a big shed, and then got a multinational interested, signed up, and then spent £2 million building it. So effectively that whole site now overall is incredibly profitable for them because they've now got another tenant in. They've created £2 million of a building on it, but they've increased the overall value of the building or the whole complex for less capital output.
And I suppose that's where maybe you're talking there about an industrial estate side of things. In terms of, I suppose maybe linking it kind of back there in terms of your return, does vacancies have a big part to play in it? Because in terms of a residential side of things, most of the time you wouldn't really have a property sitting that long at the minute. In terms of vacancy, would you maybe have slightly more chance of having vacancies within your commercial side of things?
Probably now, yes. Your vacancies would normally sit longer. So for instance, just to compare it, if you have a shop on the main street or a unit on the main street, depending on the town, it could be hard enough to relet. So to compare towns, the likes of, you drive up Cookstown or drive up Banbridge, there's not an empty unit. Those two towns are unbelievably thriving and every single unit is filled. And if one goes empty, it fills fairly quickly. They're two good towns that I can think of. There's probably more, but they're the two jumping out at me. But compare that to the likes of Portadown, Lurgan, it's very sparse, very few there. And once a unit goes empty, it's taken a very, very long time to relet. Yeah. And you normally find if it relets, I can think of a few, it's maybe somebody who's trying to start up a business, or and they're going in and you just know that they've bitten off far too much and they're only lasting a few months or a year or two, and then they're pulling out again.
I think as you mentioned there, was it Portadown, kind of, if anyone's familiar with it, you've obviously where the Halifax Bank was, and was there a beauty place beside that? Was it Franklin's or something along those lines?
Could have been, yes.
And they're both sitting now, and they were big-ish units, and they have been sitting now for quite a while. And
then Santander's leaving.
Yeah.
Too.
It, as you say, there are a couple of people pulling out of the town can just make it completely, completely different. And then is it as enticing for a business to move in to a town that's half empty?
And then those industries that are pulling out of it, there's nobody else then replacing them. So for instance, the likes of, there was New Look, which was a clothes shop that went into administration years ago. There's no other clothes shop coming in, whether it's a multinational, because if they can't make it work, well, then any other multinational's not going to come in. And then the shop is so large that no privately run owner is going to come in and take that on.
Yeah, and I suppose these are the types of things that you need to weigh up, and we always talk about risk. Are these the types of things that you need to be building into your risk and your strategy and considering this whenever you're considering commercial?
Yeah. It's probably it's a different level of investment, and like everything, what could be very expensive to one person isn't expensive to the other person. And that's basically what it comes down to. So it's another step up, but it's the same principles that always apply to it.
In terms of, and I suppose we've kind of touched on this, in terms then of obviously what makes good locations, is it for commercial property, is it kind of that case of, for example, a business park that maybe has X amount of different people within it, that people will come there anyway? So if they're coming there anyway, it's more known, things like that. You know, high streets, for example, if there's a well-known shop that's fairly busy, you know, would you be best trying to maybe park up beside them, for example, because you know that there's a crowd coming to it? Are these all the kind of things then in terms of location that you're thinking about?
It's those things, and then also it's the more you can visualize it as to, you know, a lot of people think it's a matter of, well, there's an empty unit, I'll advertise it for rent. But if you're really good at what you do, is you immediately think to yourself, well, you know what, there's a row of industrial units and it's slightly out of town. There's a chip shop there and there's a Chinese two next door, but there's an empty unit. You know what would work there? You know, another takeaway, so it's an Indian pizza, what have you, and you immediately go out to those providers and say, right, here, I can give you this unit, and here you go. You know, these are all complementing each other, and you normally find that's, you know, you're going out doing the work, you're visualizing, and you're making that, you're making it work.
Yeah.
Whereas I can think of years ago, this could be going back maybe 10, 12 years ago, you know, that complex in Sprucefield where the cinema and all is, and there used to be, I'm showing me age, there used to be, Extravision was there years ago, and then there was a pizza place, and you don't know what I'm talking about now?
Nope.
You know where the cinema is in Lisburn? That complex anyway.
I'm not from this part of the town.
Neither am I, but I can remember it being up for sale, and at that time I had a couple of clients looking at it, and they thought to themselves, no, you know, it's a wee bit too risky. It was coming in out of, it was in and around the recession. People maybe weren't going out on Friday nights to spend the money on expensive meals and what have you. So give that a miss. But then again, being, you know, 5-6 years later, it's thriving. There was a few extra tenants came into it. That's really annoying me now where that was, or what do you call it? A few years later, then it's thriving and it's doing brilliant ever since. So it's just a matter of having the nerve and probably being able to predict. You know, at that time for that investor, it didn't suit because he had the money and he needed the money to work for him. But yet for the right person who could have come in and bought that, basically taking a gamble on it to say, may not work, might be a wee bit slow here, but in the long run, I know in 10 years' time this is going to be a clinker. Well then, yes, buy it.
Yeah. In terms then of leases and tenants, and, you know, obviously having someone move into maybe a property that you've bought, then is there a time frame on them in terms of, you know, kind of what would be a minimum, or is there a maximum, or is it kind of just what is decided between the tenant and the landlord?
It's nearly up to the negotiation, who's stronger. Typically or traditionally years ago, it was always you know, if you were a tenant and you were asking for a lease less than 10 years, you were laughed at. You know, you had no credibility whatsoever. Leases were 10, 15, 20, 25 year leases. Whereas now, depending on the circumstances, it could be the case whereby it's a unit that's been sitting empty for a long time and a landlord's happy to get somebody in. You normally find it's a minimum of about 5 years. But again, if it's, you know, in a real good area, definitely the landlord would be asking for probably about a 10 year.
Yeah. And then that's obviously, as a business, that's a big consideration.
It's a big commitment.
You know, because you're tying yourself there for 10 years. I'm guessing there's no real, well, unless you're putting clauses and stuff with break clause, you know. If
you negotiate, you can include in a break clause, but even still, you're committing yourself probably for about 5 years. Mm-hmm. And what a lot of people don't realise is it's called a 5-year break clause, but you have to give your notice 6 months before the 5 years. So it's really only a 4.5 year lease before you realise, and then you're committing yourself to the next jump, which is 10 years. So, you know, and the first few years of business, it can always be, you know, particularly if you're starting out, it can be a bit of a challenge.
Yeah. And then that's what I mean, as you say there, when you have those fees, you know, that you're having to pay out, you know, those costings, those different types of things, and you're trying to just get yourself up on your feet. Yeah. You know, it's a big consideration to be moving into a high street somewhere. what happens then if your tenant, I suppose this might tap into your legal side of things, Roy, but you know, your tenant's maybe mucking about, maybe not paying the rent, or they've just decided they up and go?
Normally, there's a big difference between a commercial tenant and a residential tenant. Residential tenant, there's probably less hold or less ties on them. They would generally not have any assets themselves. So the point I'm getting at is, if they do a runner on you, it's not worth pursuing them. Most of the time it's not worth pursuing, because the cost of pursuing them completely outstrips, and they wouldn't maybe even have any money to pay you back. Whereas in a commercial world, it's quite often that the tenant does have, you know, they're going to have a house, more than likely they're going to own their own house. They're maybe going to have all their assets, investments, things like that. So if they do a runner, as you say, or leave, then you could pursue them, and generally there's a bit more substance to go after.
Yeah.
And even if it is a lease that's been signed up under a limited company, thinking you're protected, it's very, very rare will the lease just simply sit at that. There's normally a personal guarantee which pulls the tenant in personally, which means their personal assets are at risk if they don't pay the rent. Likewise, if they don't pay any of their bills and things, well, if they don't pay their bills, that's slightly different. They're protected under a limited company, but from the rent point of view, they're pulled in under the personal guarantee. So if they do a runner, you pursue them. So it can be high risk.
Yeah. And I suppose this probably then leads on to my next section, which is, what are the kind of biggest risks for someone that's new to commercial property investment?
What's the biggest risks? Probably you need to know what you're at, because it's a completely different ball game. You know, what I come across is a lot of people in the residential world, they think it's easy and they learn it as they go along. And with a degree of that, you can land on your feet and you can be lucky. And if you don't land on your feet, yes, it does cost you, but most people seem to be lucky enough. Commercial side of things, if you don't know what you're at and you get it wrong, it can cost you a lot more. So for instance, it's normally very rare would somebody buy commercial property and not have a managing agent looking after everything for them. You know, at the end of the day, it's normally much more substantial of a building cost. If anything goes wrong, the likes of a fire, you know, damage, anything like that, it's very, very costly. And if you've no rent or no nothing coming in, you know, for some people they could lose everything. So the high risk is probably from compliance and a management point of view. So definitely would recommend, if you're getting into that game, take good, strong advice from an agent, and have that agent basically be guiding you, be managing, and be looking after you.
Because it's only that you've actually mentioned it there, but you know, the likes of commercial units there, and especially if they're lying vacant, are much more susceptible to vandalism and, you know, people breaking in, trashing the place. You know, that side of things is quite common, especially when it comes to those empty commercials that's maybe been sitting there 5, 6, 7, 8 years or whatever, and it's sitting there. It's a prime target. And
if they get in and then maybe start a fire, that could end up burning the whole complex down. And whether maybe you don't own the rest of the complex or what have you, but then you're pulled in. You know, if you burn down the units next door and you don't own them, you're dragged into that. And have you got insurance? Did you forget to have insurance? You know, is all the compliance in place? Was there security checks? Was as in physical security guards? You know, inspections, all of that. And if that's not paid out by the insurance company, you know, you could be, you know, if that's a commercial premises that's cost you £1 million and it's burnt down, it's going to cost a lot more than £1 million to fix it all. So it is a lot more risky.
Yeah. And as you say there, you know, very easily you could be pulled in personally, and therefore, you know, the chances are you've lost everything.
Yeah.
And it's something that's, again, we're not trying to scare people here, you know, because I know sometimes we come across as,
sensible.
You know, we've just burnt down a complex there and we've just bankrupted someone, you know, but it's kind of, it's back to that risk and, you know, risks and
guidance, getting the right advice.
Due diligence then, is that back to having someone, as you've just mentioned there, that can guide you, that can sort of show you the steps, or be able to kind of be a shoulder there that you can sort of rely on? Is that what you're looking for, especially in this type of game?
Absolutely. You need your full team around you. So that is, you need your good solicitor, you need a good agent on board, and you need a good accountant. And you need all those three for your due diligence. So the agent side of things, basically they can then look at the rents and say, right, well, they're suitable rents, or you know what, we could maybe get those rents up a wee bit, or you know, there's demand for this new tenant or what have you. So that's what you need there. Your solicitor to check all the legal paperwork, and then there's also making sure everything's done right. You know, there's different allowances, there's capital allowances, there's checking are all the leases up to date, you know, is that all right? And then from the accountancy point of view, you want to make sure about VAT. You don't want to be paying double stamp duty because there's VAT linked to the property. As I say, those capital allowances, the structure of how it's being bought. You know, I'm just trying to simplify it, but occasionally I've come across, you know, a couple of people buying commercial. They don't even have an accountant to start with, and they're getting the accountant at a later date. Whereas had they got the accountant at the very start, they could have saved thousands, maybe £10,000 in different things. So, due diligence point of view, yes, you need to pull your team and have that team together.
It's nearly as if you read my mind, Roy, because one of my next questions was, do you need a professional team like solicitors, agents, or surveyors from the very beginning?
Yes. I think I'm going to be a bit controversial here and say, if you want to do it right, you can't be cheap. And what I mean by that is you do come across people who price around for everything and they've no loyalty. And if they're buying a property here, they'll pick the cheapest solicitor this time. If they're going there, they'll pick the cheapest solicitor. You know, that's no good to you. You need to have at all times a good solicitor who knows you personally, who knows what's your thoughts here, what's the plan, what's the goals, what's the vision. Likewise, your accountant, to have that all on board. You need to have everybody together, and if you're a cheap person, you're going to be bitten very badly and possibly very quickly in the commercial world, as opposed to you can get away with it in the residential world.
I'm going to say then, final sort of, what would be the one sort of thing that you would sort of recommend for people when starting out then? Would it be going sort of get the right team around you when you start, before you even think?
Absolutely,
about
yes.
Setting your foot in the game? Yeah.
So do your research. And I actually forgot about as well, team-wise, I was assuming if you weren't going down the finance route, if you're going down the finance route, it is very important as well to get the right person to help you out as well. But what was your question? Get the team right, or get the team?
What piece of, what recommendation would you have for someone beginning?
If you didn't have that team, get speaking to a team. So pull together the right solicitor, mortgage advisor, a agent, an accountant, and have a chat with them. And ultimately, you need to have the right sort of funds behind you as well. Now, not to go off on a tangent, but there's other ways of getting funds. It could be the case of maybe for your first project or two, maybe bringing in somebody else with you. Maybe you have a friend or somebody else that you can trust, that you work with, who's a pool of money as well. At least you're sharing the risk. You're maybe pulling together a bit more, expertise, and you're just sharing responsibilities side of things. But basically, yes, you could go down that route, or another route would be you can pull finance out of a private pension if you have it, which it can be very, very tax efficient to do that. But that's completely unique to a scenario. So I'm not just going to say that's a tax efficient way. It can be, but certainly if you've the right accountant and people on board, that will maximize your efficiency, reduce your costs, and make it worthwhile.
So probably to sum it up, if you haven't already been involved in property and invested in property, commercial to start with would not be the best idea. Probably
not. I'm just thinking at the minute I'm working with a number of investors who have been in the residential game for easily 10 years and they've built up a very large portfolio. And that's why they're now thinking to themselves, let's have a balanced portfolio. Let's look at other alternative investments. But at least they have that, the right mindset and the right skill set that they can, yes, there's the big difference between commercial and residential, but they still have a mindset and a skill set that is transferable over to commercial.
Yeah. So probably first steps, if you are thinking about it, would be sort of go down the residential route and kind of understand it, kind of know what you're getting yourself into, rather than going straight into a commercial and not having the team around you and getting yourself in a bit of a sticky mess.
Exactly.
Episode 29, Roy. Thank you very much. That
no problem.
Was commercial property. A lot of interesting points in there, a lot of things to think about, and I'm certain that there'll be people out there that'll be taking this on board and maybe having a think about it. So if you are having a think about it, use any questions, send them over to our social media pages, and myself or Roy will be able to give you a wee shout back.
I'll happily look at a few ideas or a few projects that anybody's thinking about. I can certainly work through it with you and say, listen, that could be a brilliant idea, and by all means I can make a few recommendations if you do need, maybe you do have a good accountant but you don't need, or you need a good agent or mortgage broker or what have you. Certainly get in touch and I'll help you out.
That'll do, right. Thank you very much. Episode 29, and stay tuned folks for the next episode, hopefully in the next couple of weeks.